All right, hi folks. I'm going to skip the regular intro tonight, and we're trying something a little bit different here. Recently was asked to collaborate on a video project with another prominent heavy metal YouTuber, which was really cool. And so tonight's video is going to be sort of back and forth video that we recorded on, I think, what'll be a cool topic that'll interest a lot of folks. I have tried using a different program to record this conversation, so the video format's going to be a little different than what you may be used to seeing. Let me know in the comments down below if you like the way the video turned out, if you really don't like this particular video format. I'd like to do more things along this line in the future, but I'm still figuring out what's going to be the best way to make this type of video. So let me know what you think in particular about the formatting on this one, whether you like the topic and having the sort of two-person discussion or not as much. Thanks so much, and hope you enjoy the video. Let's go. Okay, we are going live. Hello, everybody. It's that time again. My name is Alan, and tonight, let's talk metal with this guy, Marty. Nice.
How y'all doing? Thanks for having me, Alan. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for offering. Yeah, had been thinking about doing a collaboration with someone, and when you offered, it was like, hell yes, that would be great.
This is a long overdue collaboration too. We've known each other for many a year, it seems.
It has, yep. There's some gaps in there, but
yep.
Yeah, we've kind of come back, paths have crossed once again here this year, which has been cool to catch back up.
Yep, and technology is in our favor. We can actually talk to each other and get to know each other a little bit more than the occasional, message board reply or, quick email, which I'm growing to typically hate. So this is way better.
Exactly, I would have to agree. And yeah, I think we found something, we obviously, our tastes in music overlap, and I think we both had this topic sort of on our minds to discuss at some point. It just made sense to, sort of discuss it together. And the idea is talking a little bit about power metal, which isn't the first genre most people think of in association with, you or Bindrune necessarily, or, any of the Friday night streams, but it's a topic that keeps coming up on those streams. And a lot of times,
I love it.
It's a lot of good stuff. And it's always interesting watching the chat, because there's always some folks that are kind of like, wait, what do you mean US power metal? Or wait, why? I don't like power metal because it's all this, foo-foo, frilly European stuff. But there's a very different style of power metal that maybe a lot of people aren't as familiar with, that you and I can geek out about for a while and show some cool records and try to figure out what the heck it is and is not, because it's not an easy one to pin down, as we've discussed.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what is power metal? How do we sort of try to fence it in a little bit, at least? What do you think? What makes it different in particular from the bands like Iron Maiden, Priest, Saxon, Motorhead? You never hear those bands referred to as power metal, and
no.
I wouldn't argue they are, but
no.
At some point you do start referring to bands as power metal. Is there something that distinguishes them?
Well, I mean, I think public perception, I think when they hear power metal, they think of the European style. That is something that was set very much full in motion by Keeper of the Seven Keys 1 and Keeper of the Seven Keys Part 2, which is very much, the foundation is a driving double bass drum. It is highly melodic, largely in key chord progressions with dueling guitar harmonies, and a very operatic soaring metal vocalist a la Rob Halford or Bruce Dickinson, which obviously Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, Saxon, all those bands were very much a very influential cocktail to I think what started in Germany, to me. I mean, I'm sure there's going to be people, and when we get into this conversation, there's going to be like, well, why didn't you talk about this band? Or why didn't you talk about that band? It's just a million bands, and Alan's way more versed in this subject than I am, but
don't sell yourself short.
Well, I'm just saying that, for me, the HELLOWEEN stuff was very much an eye-opener, and it was obviously a big eye-opener for the European market too, because it shifted the focus off of speed metal, which Helloween was, and bands like Blind Guardian. Other bands of that ilk were very much speed metal bands, to me anyway. I mean, yes, they're melodic at times. They, you know, people are like, no, it's not. It's not. It is. It's very speed metal attack. But the Keeper albums brought more of a commercial slant, more of a lighthearted, optimistic, positive slant into the music, and it could maintain a very powerful, sometimes speed metal-y foundation, backbone, but could dip into AOR, could dip into other styles as well to bring more people, more fans into the fold. But
yeah, that was something.
as Alan will tell you, there was also the US power metal scene, which is quite different in my eyes anyway.
There is, yeah. And I think you touched on something important there that we stumbled across while chatting, is that, yeah, power metal, it draws from a lot of different influences and it can overlap into a lot of those different fields. And yeah, in terms of tracking down, you know, where power metal starts and comes from, you and I have bounced a lot of names off of one another. Some things that you know, came up were obviously Judas Priest, I think has to be, you know, mentioned. So time to start flashing records. You know, around this era when they're doing Hellbent for Leather and Unleashed in the East, you know, Priest was obviously reinventing their image, kind of speeding up, changing their sound a bit, and that velocity has an influence on power metal and all heavy metal moving forward. But even before that, I mean, there's a lot of Deep Purple songs that are much earlier in the 70s. They get covered all the time by power metal bands. And, you know, those songs are, you know, coming out like on Machine Head as early as 72 and, you know, the Burn album in 74. So roots go back that far for power metal influences. You know, you and I talked about, you know, Dio's contributions to power metal, that giving it that sort of, again, like you mentioned, the operatic kind of style of vocal, the more soaring vocals, and, you know, the heavy steeped in fantasy imagery, and that it could be kind of uplifting, it could be dark, but it didn't have to be as serious or dark as, you know, your traditional heavy metal where everybody's always bullet belts and trying to look tough, and you don't get that vibe as much always in power metal.
Yes.
Another one that should be, you know, mentioned was, you know, the influence of Accept. In particular, songs like Fast as a Shark and Restless and Wild. You know, we were sort of put together a little timeline of things, and we noticed that, you know, some of these albums that were coming out in 1982 were kind of right on the cusp. I don't think we would, I think you and I agreed we wouldn't call these power metal albums or power metal bands, but they're on the cusp of that. You know, there's going to be a transition there. Yeah, another one that we mentioned, like from 82, was, you know, out of Sweden, Heavy Load's influence. These guys definitely have that epic vibe that, you know, power metal often is associated with. So things were happening in 82. The US, what did we have in the US in 82? It had, the only thing I could really find maybe was that first Virgin Steel album, this crazy looking thing, which, let's see, you've heard this one, right, Marty?
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. Power metal, not power metal? Where does it fall?
I would actually call that a US version of power metal. And maybe we should make the distinction now. How was US power metal different from the European power metal?
It's a good question. And early on, it's, you know, hard to say. Every band, you know, at that time is kind of doing their own thing. So yeah, trying to find those common threads. I think something that, and this may be something that distinguishes them later, but the 80s US bands that fall towards power metal, they were still working from, I think you described it as like a sort of a blue collar vibe or mentality, that they still look kind of denim and leather.
Yep.
They just sound a little different. They sound, yeah, a little, you know, more twin harmonies, and a little, you know, the vocalist is usually more powerful or stronger sounding.
Yep.
But at the same time, some of the early European bands are still doing that as well. But yeah,
well, like, you know, you look at like new wave of British heavy metal, that is very much, it's heavy metal, but it's very much from the streets. It has that from the streets kind of feel to it. And I would say a US power metal does too. And for me, a big band for me that I always considered power metal was Omen.
Yep.
And I mean, one thing that Omen had in common with Europe or Britain is the new wave of British heavy metal. They had very much a solid Iron Maiden influence.
Very much so. Yeah. Yeah. Maiden had influenced a lot of bands. By this point, Maiden's first album had come out in 80, but they were already a well-known band. And so, yeah, but within a couple of years, you're seeing that influence in new wave of British heavy metal. You've got bands like Tokyo Blade, which are one part Iron Maiden, one part maybe early Def Leppard, and, starting to edge towards a power metal sound. I don't have a copy of it to show off, but Satan's Court in the Act is usually considered one of those kind of proto power metal releases. The first Jaguar album, this could go, you could call this early thrash, early speed, or early power, depending on who you're talking to.
Yep.
The first Grim Reaper album, the first Chateau album with Steve Grimmett on vocals, Chained and Desperate. And all these are coming out in 83. So it's kind of interesting. Again, some of these albums, of course, were recorded in 82, but just in terms of release dates, in 82, you kind of struggle to find many albums that you would say, yeah, I'd call that power metal. You get to 83, and they're popping up all over the place. The new wave of British heavy metal is trending that way. And like you said, the US is trending that way really fast as well. Let's see. The big one for me in 83, and we can debate this because I think you have a different take, is Warlord in the US with the awesome Deliver Us, of course.
If I were to compare that to like Omen, I would say, I mean, to me, Omen was very much power metal, as are like the first two Metal Church albums, which we'll talk about those later. But that to me was a little bit more traditional metal influence. But then again, where does that fall? I mean, traditional metal influenced power metal, as in which that went off to influence a bunch of other things as well. But such a great album. If no one here has not heard that album, pick up Warlord Deliver Us. It's so good.
Yeah, it's one of the earliest examples of US, traditional power metal, and it's still one of the best. Absolutely. Yeah. It's a classic. But yeah, the US, other bands are popping up in 83. I don't have the first Savage Grace EP, but Savage Grace was on the scene in 83, and that featured Kenny Powell, who quickly went on to form Omen on his own.
And that first Savage Grace EP, it kind of struck me as being a little hard rock. There's a little bit of hard rock influence in there. You can kind of tell those early 80s albums were very much, that's what they were feeding off of, was hard rock.
Yep. There's a lot of that in there. Europe, was getting a few things too. That first Pretty Maids EP comes out in 83. So you got that from Denmark, and your Pretty Maids went much more sort of AOR kind of slick commercial sounding rapidly, but the early stuff, it could make a claim to being sort of an early form of power metal alongside these other bands. What's interesting, when we talk 1983, the country we haven't mentioned with any of these albums is Germany.
Yeah.
That you don't really have a big German output until the following year, which, I think it flies a little bit in the face of convention. People really associate the term power metal with Europe now. But, as you and I have just mentioned, there's a ton of this stuff in the US at the same time the new wave of British heavy metal bands are going towards power metal, that it's happening side by side. It's not that new wave of British heavy metal kind of established power metal and then the US bands copied that.
What year did Iron Angel's Hellish Crossfire hit? That's not really a thrash. I mean, there's a little bit of power metal mixed in with that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't call that, I don't know. It's so weird. That album sits weird for me.
It does sit weird. You're exactly right. I want to say it's about 84, maybe 85. It's a year or two after, because Winds of War, I'm pretty sure, is 86. And so it's probably going to be a year.
Hellish Crossfire came out in 84. That beats, Helloween's Walls of Jericho came out in 85.
Yeah. Now, the Germans are definitely getting on the scene by 84. You've got, a lot of things hitting. The first Running Wild album is recent. And again, of course, Running Wild was around before this. They had, their EP, their compilation appearances are in 83. So things were happening in Germany in 83. You just weren't seeing full-length releases happening just yet. Stormwitch, Walpurgis Night comes out in 84. There's probably lots of other German ones. Like you said, we can't mention every band, but Germany's definitely putting out albums by 84. But, other countries are still doing it too. That's, Omen's Battle Cries 84. That first Metal Church that you just mentioned is
I pulled it. We might as well look at it.
Definitely should. Yep. Oh, yours is on vinyl. You're cooler than I am.
I got mine for $8 at a record show.
Very cool.
Lucky.
Yep. So power metal or traditional metal for Metal Church?
To me, that's power metal. But I think a lot of people would say I'm an idiot and say, no, that's thrash, because that's kind of where they were lumped. I think.
Yeah, they never quite got that.
Really kind of started to maybe be the crossover album for them, but I don't know. To me, this is power metal. I mean, this is good US power metal. They were never really a thrash band as far as I'm concerned.
I would agree. You're right. They got lumped in with thrash a lot of times, and I never really got that out there. But again, right there at the very end of that first
Highway Star, yep.
Highway Star,
Purple.
Deep Purple. Playing it at the time, it would have been, about a 10-year-old Deep Purple cover song.
Yep.
On this early traditional / power metal album. But let's see. Yeah, the US was doing things in 84. Germany's doing things in 84.
Well, Canada, I mean, let's look at this one. A lot of people would debate this as well. I don't know what year this came out. The lighting in here sucks, but Long Live the Loud by Exciter. To me,
Exciter's on the map by this time, definitely.
This is very much a power metal. This is my favorite Exciter album, actually. I mean, I just love the power of this record, and it's just so stripped down, well written, balls to the wall, heavy metal, power metal, however you want to call it. But yeah, to me, this is a power metal record, and fight me on that.
I can't, but Exciter is one of those bands I have always had a hard time trying to label. And sure, okay, maybe that means it's a good thing, and let's be honest, at the end of the day, trying to label some things is a little bit, just a thought.
Trying to put everything in we were going through this outline that you sent to talk about. I mean, there's a lot of stuff on the list I have not heard, but as I went and listened to them, I'm reminded of how unique the early bands were. Every single one of these old bands had their own sound, which is a phenomenon that has kind of faded away as the years have gone on. A lot of bands just kind of, nowadays, everybody's trying to rip off Helloween, or everybody's trying to rip off Dark Throne or Burzum, or I don't know, stuff like that.
Yep. And let's follow that sidetrack for just a moment, because you and I have touched on it, that happens to all genres. It seems that when a new style or a new scene arrives, every band has its own sound.
Yep.
But once it hits like a critical threshold of popularity, and you start getting that next wave of bands coming out, a lot of those bands tend to pick a lane and just follow their favorite band.
Yeah.
That you lose some of that originality. You saw it in it happened in death metal, it happened in black metal, it happened in punk. All your early punk bands, they sound nothing alike. And then by the time you get, 78, 79, they're all, okay, this band's going to be a Clash, knockoff, and this band's going to be a Sex Pistols wannabe, and this band's just going to sound like the Ramones.
Granted, back then there was way less bands, and a lot of the bands that were coming out were pulling influences from hard rock and some punk and new wave of British heavy metal, other things like that. And there was a lot of room for creative exploration. And I don't think, a set in stone sound was defined yet. And nowadays, these younger people are influenced by a definite sound. They're not listening to Deep Purple and coming up with, tuning down and playing with more distortion, and all of a sudden their bastardized Deep Purple riffs or an Omen record or whatever. They're listening to Helloween, they're listening to Rhapsody, they're listening to this technicality. The instrumentation has gotten so crazy technical and so good that that's what these younger people are getting influenced by. Whereas the old school stuff, that was being influenced by 2-3 chords. And power, the power and intent behind the chords, was, and your singer.
Yeah, when Helloween's starting, they don't have any other German or European power metal bands much to look at.
Judas
Whereas,
Priest. There's Judas Priest all over that stuff. Judas Priest,
yeah.
I've talked about this a million times. I mean, I was always a Maiden guy because there was that rift. Oh, I can't listen to Priest because I listen to Maiden. Well, now I kick myself because I realize now that Judas Priest is just as good, if not maybe better at times than Maiden. And I'm catching up, trying to fill my holes in that. But Priest, I think, influenced a lot, just as many bands, if not more, than Maiden did.
Oh yeah, yeah, both of them for sure.
They're first on the scene too, weren't they? Wasn't the first?
Oh yeah, Priest's first album comes out in 74 and probably earlier, because I think Sad Wings of Destiny is 74 and that's their second.
Yeah,
I don't know if Rockarola was 73 maybe then.
So they were coming out the same time Kiss was in the States. It's amazing the difference sounds and the different style, the New York influence to the Birmingham influence.
Yep.
A little darker, a little more, a little less loose, a little more planned out, I think.
Little moodier, a little less party. Yep.
Sorry, I got sidetracked again.
No, that's okay. But yeah, going just, I mean, in 84, the hits just kept coming. Hellstar out of Texas. There's a power metal sound to this album. And this band really went down the power metal pathway with every album. They got more and more. This band sounds very, of the US bands, this one probably sounds the most European to me by the time you get to their later stuff. But yeah, this is very analogous to what Germany was doing in 84. Now here's one. Where do we put this? Other than in the worst cover art imaginable bin.
You know what? It does. It's a crappy artwork, but it always just fit that record to me. That's just the way it is. And that, I don't know, there's a childish atmosphere to that cover, but I always kind of liked it, and it's terrible. I don't get it. It's awful. But where does it fall? I mean, they were always a traditional metal band for me.
I would say the same. They never quite, if anything, maybe by Spectre Within, they're leaning towards some power metal influences, but they're also getting more proggy at the same time.
Yeah.
So they kind of do their own thing at that point.
And it's funny because they were on Metal Blade at that time, which, for me, that was a big power metal label for me. I mean, Metal Blade. And, we talk about bands that kind of ride the cusp. This one, Lizzie Borden.
Yeah, what do you think? Now, you know a lot more of Borden's catalog than I do. Where do they fit? I always thought of them kind of in that same, somewhere around the Wasp camp, but that may have just been because of the appearance.
See, to me, like, this album could very much been a sibling of Omen. It's got a Maiden influence to it. I think these guys are a little more influenced by the LA scene, so there's a little bit of a, you talk about Wasp, yeah, there might be a little of that hair metal on there, but they kept it street enough to not fall into that and make it kind of like cheesy. It's, I don't know, this is just there's a lot of Maidenism on this record, and this one here is a little more aggressive, but Lizzie Borden's vocals are very much, they could have a glammy quality to them, I suppose, but I don't know that I would call that band power metal, but man, they're right there. They're right holding hands with that stuff. They're right on the cusp of, that's just it. A lot of this stuff is, we shouldn't be sitting here classifying music. Music is music. It's all, at the end of the day, heavy metal, but power metal, for me, the American stuff has a completely different feel than what came out in Europe, and Europe ended up changing everybody over to their way of thinking, I think.
Very much so. And one in 84, I think that we hadn't mentioned, and I don't have a copy of it to show, maybe you do, but it kind of presages that change, is Malmsteen's Rising Force.
Yeah, I've got those. You want me to get one? Get them?
If you want to, yeah. Because, yeah, that's a band that, blends, obviously US and European musicians together. And, that's the band that really introduces this highly technical, really, the prodigy on guitar work that later becomes associated with European type power metal, even though the band is part European and part American. Yep.
And this is good stuff. These three Yngwie albums, not all the songs are good. And there's a lot of wanking on it, but that's what you're going to get with the Guitar Hero. Just the way it goes.
Yep.
There's some good songs on this stuff.
Yeah, there's some great music on there.
This here, they got a kind of a, who's singing on this? Mark Bowles. Wasn't he in Riot? No.
Nope. But he did.
Why is that name familiar?
Yeah, I'm drawing a blank, but it is familiar. He's sung with other folks. And I'm sure
there is some glammy elements to this, but it's still a really good album. This is the last of his that I've heard and care about.
Yeah.
So, but yeah.
Yep.
So definitely had a hand in molding some stuff.
Definitely. So before we get to sort of the big watershed moment, let's run through some bands that we had sort of mentioned. Again, like you said, on the cusp. What about this?
Oh, fuck yeah. To me, the first two Overkill albums are very power metal.
And
that album is probably one of my top 10 favorite albums. I love Feel the Fire. It's such a great record.
This is an A+ album to me. I remember when I first got this album, it almost scared me shitless hearing the way Bobby Blitz sings. He's just so pissed, nasty sounding on there. It's just like, geez, this is another level compared to the stuff I was listening to.
Yep. And that the first two albums very much, and Taking Over has more of a full throttle guitar sound, which to me makes it even more power metal, and less thrash. But they ended up being pigeonholed as thrash, and they ended up kind of starting to lean that way a bit.
They did lean that way quickly, and that's what most people, associate them with. Didn't mention it, but Sabotage again was on the scene as early as '83. Power metal or traditional metal or just good metal?
It's good metal. I think it leans on the cusp. It's more traditional metal to me, but that band, Hall of the Mountain King, is probably my favorite. And I just recently got those two albums, and man, they're just weird. They do some weird shit in there that kind of sets them apart, like these weird shrieks and stuff. It's like, I don't know, I can't do it, but it sets them apart. Is strange,
They really are strange compared to a lot of the U.S. bands for sure.
But I'm not saying it's bad. It's still I've been very impressed by that stuff. But it's like to me, it's a lot of traditional metal in there.
Yeah, we should have probably mentioned Queensryche. In '83, Queensryche's already on the scene and already doing tracks like Queen of the Reich that have all those things you mentioned before. The high operatic, obviously one of the best vocalists of the era. Yeah, all the fantasy elements are here. The really good guitar work is on here. And this is American, and this is '83. This is before Noise Records has released anything more than a couple of compilations, really. Yep.
So where does that sit for you? To me, that's traditional metal. I mean, that's very Priest influence to me.
To me, I still call it traditional metal, but thinking about it, it'd be hard to object if someone wanted to say that's early power metal. It's close. It's in that ballpark. Some others. Where does Manowar fit into all this?
Other bands play Manowar kill. I love Manowar, and to me, that the Battle Hymns, the first album, to me, another album very influenced by hard rock. There's a lot of hard rock isms on that.
It almost is a hard rock album. It's
in a lot of ways, and it isn't until towards the end that you start getting that epic doomy heavy metal, spirit. Are they power metal? I wouldn't. On the traditional thoughts, I don't think they're just a traditional metal band to me, but they're very much influenced by the same things that influence power metal.
Yeah, they've got the killer vocalist. They've got Manowar has that very strong epic vibe to them also, which is often associated with a lot of power metal label later on. Manila Road.
It's kind of the same. I mean, Manila Road to me is epic metal, and they ended up getting, when they reformed, I think they got a little thrashier. Well, you know what? They got a little thrashier before that with the
they were thrashy
stuff like that. But when they got back together in the 2000s, they took the epic metal and threw it more into a modern metal spirit. What was going on? I think it was great. But the early stuff to me, I mean, like their first album is a jam hard rock jam record.
I agree wholeheartedly. Yep.
Are they power metal? No, they're just an epic metal band to me. I mean, I don't know why we're subcategorizing again. It's all heavy metal, but
but it seemed different directions it went. So let's get to the moment. I think we can both agree when power metal really started to become established and have a sort of something that people could point to and say, this is power metal.
I would agree. But before that, on Walls of Jericho, I would say the song Ride the Sky is the ultimate precursor to what power metal would eventually embrace. Because if you strip it down note for note, Ride the Sky is probably one of the best heavy metal songs ever made. Hands down. The harmonies, the way the feel comes back and forth. Oh my God, what a great, it's still in a speed metal context, but you know, that dueling, Vicky and Hansen doing the dueling guitar harmonies at the same time.
Yep.
Very Maiden-esque, but has a German twist where it's faster and more intense and more spot on.
Yep.
But you know, that one too, so fucking good.
If Michael Kiske had been singing on Walls of Jericho, would it move out of speed metal and a little closer to power metal? Because I've heard him sing on, you know, there's versions, of course, of him singing tracks like Starlight and all.
Yep.
And it's a natural fit. It
doesn't fit.
It fits fine. Yeah.
I think it fits fine, but it changes the feel of that song.
It does. It does change the vibe.
It gives it more of their, you know, power metal style as opposed to, you know, Kai's desperate charge in his vocals, you know.
That he has this early on, he has that weird reptilian rasp to it.
Yeah. Yeah, so good. Which he can't really do anymore. I think he's fried him, and he smokes way too much, so it's kind of fucked up his throat over the years.
Oh, yeah, I don't think he wants to do it anymore necessarily either. But yeah, I think we'd agree, and I think a lot of people would agree that, you know, if you're looking at kind of, you know, where power metal would trace its roots to, without a doubt, you know, these are the albums that launch 1,000 more bands.
Yep.
And probably where it starts to get a little bit into that copycat thing that we were mentioning earlier, that after this point you have bands maybe start to sound a little less unique, and they start being like, yeah, I want to make Keeper of the Seven Keys Part 3, and I want to record Keeper of the Seven Keys Part 4. But yeah, right here, 87, 88, this is kind of the watershed moment for power metal. This is where it becomes its own thing.
I think Keeper 1 of the two albums has a little bit more of a dark, they're a little darker, and the songs are a little more serious.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I mean, Keeper 2 has that serious dark songs, but also like Dr. Steen and Future World. I mean, there's very much a positive
Rise and Fall,
you know, happy-go-lucky type of thing.
And I know in the Noise record book you recommended, Damn the Machine, you know, there's a mention that, you know, those two albums, like part 1 is Kai's album and part 2 is Weiki's album.
Yep.
That, you know, there, and you can tell there's a very distinct difference between the two.
Yep.
For sure. But yeah, you've got other bands doing great stuff around that time. You know, this little band pops up in 88. Same time good. Keepers 2 comes out.
Yep.
And this is such a killer album. You know, most people don't know them until later, but
they have a long string of killer albums. They really do.
They have as good a streak from the late 80s to the end of the 90s. They've got a 10-year period where they never really missed a step.
Yep.
In the US, I wasn't finding as many things I wanted to point out from the US as you get later into the 80s, but I think one that has to be mentioned is Riot's Thundersteel.
Such a good album.
This album is fucking incredible. Yep. Again, for being in the US in the late 80s, this starts to feel a little out of place geographically. It almost feels like this should have been a European band making.
It's got a very European feel to it, for sure.
Yeah, and it's so weird because it's, you know, Riot had like a 5-year hiatus before this album came out. They've got a very different lineup. So, you know, folks that are familiar with, you know, Swords and Tequila and all those great early 80s, a lot of them hear this and they don't like it. I've heard a lot of fans of early Riot just be like, I don't like Thundersteel because it doesn't sound like Riot.
It does. It sounds, I've got just a handful of Riot albums and they all sound completely different from each other.
It's a band probably will do one of those kind of anthology videos about soon. They're one of my 5 favorite bands of all time. I love every era of Riot, and I will probably talk for over an hour when I make that video. But yes, you're exactly right. They go through a lot of different styles and phases, and this phase is very short for them. You have Thundersteel in 88, and they did one more album in that style with Tony Moore on vocals, Privilege of Power. And this one really got overlooked. It came out, I think, in 1990. And even by then, you know, things were kind of starting to pass them by.
A terrible cover. Jesus.
It is a messed up cover. Yeah. The album, it's kind of there's some incredible stuff on here, very much Thundersteel reminiscent, but there's also some stuff that gets a little goofier. It kind of reminds me of the difference between the two Scanner albums, Hypertrace and Terminal Earth.
Hypertrace is one of my favorite albums too. I love that album. It's so overlooked.
Yeah, and it's so straightforward. And it's another one that's from 1988. It's the same window we're talking about right now.
And that is very much, they were sucking at the teat presented by Helloween for sure.
Very much so, yep. But then by the time they did Terminal Earth, they were getting a little, there's more silly stuff on there. Again, if Hypertrace is their version of Keeper 1, Terminal Earth is their version of Keeper 2.
Yep, except it didn't have the quality control that Keeper 2 had.
Yeah, with Riot, if this is their take on something like Keepers 1, this is their take on Operation Mindcrime, which we haven't mentioned, but had been a big, deal around this time too. This album has like a lot of weird little, sampling on here where their producer manager apparently was really wanting to try to get that same Operation Mindcrime vid of making it kind of a little more cerebral. You get all these weird, they do like in between songs, they're kind of, it sounds like someone's flipping television stations and stopping all these random news clips about, all the Purdue pharma companies and, DuPont and, making components for nuclear warhead detonators and, all this kind of, through the looking glass kind of stuff. It's very weird, but last one,
say that second Scanner album, Terminal Earth, I would say that is Helloween mixed with Germany's Death Row. The singer, the way he sang reminded me of the guy from Death Row a lot. I don't know. It just wasn't as good as the first. The first one was like a perfect album. Album.
Yep. Last one from the US again, and we mentioned before, Hellstar's fourth and last album before they went on hiatus at that time. This one has all those kind of neoclassical elements that you would typically associate with European bands by this point. So even this, I feel like, was starting to draw more from Helloween than what earlier Hellstar was.
Yeah.
But yeah, then we get to the 90s and things.
Well, I think by then, the Helloween power metal that swept through Europe kind of changed, turned bands out of, stuff like Omen and Tyrant and, other bands like that, early Overkill, early Metal Church, well, all Metal Church, and Metal Church never became thrash. Anything now, power metal, I think it's changed the perception in everybody's mind that power metal is double bass, dual harmonies, operatic vocals, dragons on your cover. Yes, it's sword and sorcery, Dungeons and Dragons, fantasy kind of stuff. And it coincides, at this point, this is around the point in time where those US power metal bands disappear. Bands like Omen and Savage Grace, they're fading out. They've had their run of albums, but whether it's, just lack of interest or they've gotten a little older, they've got other responsibilities, they've got families, those bands are folding. And in the US, it's very much being replaced. Death metal has become a big thing at this point. Oh, yeah. Very polarizing, changed everything.
Very different style. Even, thrash is, phasing out around that time and being replaced more with, the Pantera and Biohazard kind of sound. In Europe, maybe not as much. In Europe, you have these power metal bands that keep, Running Wild keeps churning along. Blind Guardian,
they're so good.
So good. Blind Guardian still making excellent albums. But they're only, you're not finding these in the US. These are impossible to, it's weird for, younger folks to know how hard it was to get a Blind Guardian album in the United States in, like 1994, 1995.
You paid $25 for it when you did get it.
And you'd wait, you'd wait a month for, your local indie store to find someone to import it from. And pay, $25 to $30 for it. Gamma Ray.
Now I think they may have a way that anything you buy overseas now, you get it for a good price. They're going to tack on $20 of shipping. So those times have kind of come around again. Importing stuff is not cheap again.
But yeah, Gamma Ray pops up in 1990, but it takes Gamma Ray a while to find their legs, I feel like.
It was very much Judas Priest. They got Ralph Shepers, right? Sheepers. I can't remember. I can't pronounce his name.
I always butcher it. Yeah. This is the third one, but yeah, those first two albums the first three with Ralph. Sorry, this is number 4. Those Ralph albums, they really feel like, Kai and the band are just trying things out. They're
trying things out, but the main unifying factor is Judas Priest, I think, musically. And those early Gamma Ray albums, I hated them initially, but now I go back and I actually enjoy them. I don't know what it was. I just couldn't get around Ralph's voice. I don't know, but that album was very much a defining. That is where he said, "Okay, I'm going to embrace my past with Helloween.
Yeah.
I'm going to make a kick-ass Helloween album, but I'm going to introduce a little bit of a Queen sense of theatrics." Like Man on a Mission, that whole breakdown in the middle sounds like Queen to me, you know?
And that's a great song. Yeah. Yeah. It feels like Kai's like, okay, I'm done with my experimental phase. I know I have my direction is cleared once again.
Yep. I know what people want from me.
Yeah. And I know what I want you. I've got this other, in a way, it feels like he's got this other stuff out of his system. If he wanted to try it, that's great, but he doesn't need to do that anymore. Metal popped up in weird places. For power metal, but you've got a South American power metal bands popping up. This album was getting pressed by '94 with Angra, with Andre Matos on vocals, who had been in Viper before this, but Viper never really got off the ground the way this band did. They had a good long following.
Didn't they? I've heard a couple Angra albums over the years. They never jumped out at me, but they always seemed like they had more of an AOR.
They do
influence to them.
I want to say there's a Kate Bush cover on this album, if I remember right. So yeah, they're definitely leaning more that direction. Again, it's getting closer to that stereotype European power metal sound, where it's still fast and melodic, but it's getting a little frilly sounding maybe at times. It's pretty sounding.
Yeah,
it's moved far away from the spikes and leather. The U.S., the pickings were pretty slim. We talked about this. We found one band.
Oh yeah. Yep. And that's a band that kind of stayed away from the Germanic power metal influence. They kind of clung more to the US power metal style, even though they didn't sound exactly like Omen or,
No.
They had their own thing going on, which was, and all that. And there was a long run of Iced Earth albums that are fucking great. I mean, they're good, either really good or fucking great.
Yeah, Iced Earth in the early 90s. Mentioned this to you while we were getting ready to start recording. I lost interest in Iced Earth after a while because I just felt, they got a little mediocre, but
I keep trying.
Yeah. The first 2 to 3 albums in particular were very important to me as a heavy metal, as a fan of traditional metal and power metal living in the US in the early and mid 90s. This was the band. This was your champion. When I found this, I first heard this band in '92, which probably about the time Stormbringer came out. And I was just like, I was amazed they weren't a European band. They don't sound European. They do sound very American. But like you said, they also don't sound like any American band before them. But just the fact that you had an American band playing this style of metal on Century Media in the early 90s, so that you had half a chance in hell of finding their albums when you walked into a store, was a very big deal to me. I championed this band, through the first half and into the middle 90s. I would nag the local record store. I'm like, you guys should stock their next album when it comes out. You will sell copies. And they listened to me, and they did. And they were just like, you were right. We keep getting 2 or 3 copies at a time, and they're gone in a day. I'm like, yes, people want to hear this. And there just wasn't anyone in it. And in interviews, Iced Earth was very, they were aware that they were sort of working at this weird, disadvantage in their own country.
And again, it's very much a working blue collar ethic to that music.
It goes back to that sort of that vibe that Omen and those bands had. That it's no frills, it's
no frills, no theatrics. Yeah,
no theatrics.
Yeah, they pretty much modeled as they went on. Very much modeled their aesthetic after Iron Maiden. They had their little mascot that was on all the covers, and same artist. I mean, Derek Riggs did a lot of covers for them, didn't he?
He sure did. You're right. I forgot that.
So, I mean, he took his love for Maiden and Kiss and built a foundation with that stuff. And for me, I really love the early stuff. Something Wicked, This Way Comes. I love that album, and the Horror Show. I love the songs on Horror Show. Steve DiGiorgio on bass on that one.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that. Burnt Offerings was my favorite metal album from the 1990s for quite a while.
Oh, it's great. Yeah.
It's an incredible album. They sound and it's the last album where you can tell they are very pissed off about everything on that album.
And that's Matt Barlow's first album, if I recall, isn't it?
That's correct. Yep, it's his first one. He sounds so angry. The band sounds very aggressive. There's some thrash riffage in Schaefer's work. A little bit, I'd say.
Well, he's got one of the tightest rhythm hands.
Yeah.
I mean, his down picking is fierce.
One other one from the early '90s, when you and I were, we had talked. We stopped for a little while, pulled some albums to talk about, and we didn't talk about this one. So, what do you think about Priest's Painkiller? This one came out around '90, and it's Priest, as we talked earlier. I don't think anybody would ever call Judas Priest a power metal band, but this album is very different compared to what Priest had done really before and since. It's a fast album. It's very high velocity, and it has very intense. Very intense. Was it Judas Priest trying to tap into a little bit of a power metal vibe, kind of doing a remake like Riot did with Thundersteel? Or
there's a bit of power metal in there, and the intensity could be pseudo thrash inspired. It's them obviously trying to adapt to a more intense time, both probably socially and musically. I mean, what year did that come out? I mean, death metal is definitely making its way.
I believe it's 90. It may have been 91.
Well, so it's early. I mean, but death metal is still creeping up. Death is already hitting is already in there.
1990 copyright, so 90 or early 91.
Yeah, I mean, that's Priest reinventing themselves a bit by not losing sight of what they were, but edging themselves into more of a modern time.
Yeah, it's another album where, like older fans don't like this album a whole lot because it is nothing like anything they did for the first 2 decades, but younger fans really gravitate towards this album and feel like this is the definitive Priest album for them.
And they had to do something after Turbo and Ram It Down. I mean, that was
as we were saying with Kai earlier, they got that out of their system. And but,
I still like those albums, though. I don't care.
There's good songs on those. And thinking about it right now, Ram It Down, it was something like the title track. Is that any less power metal than anything we've been talking about from these other European bands?
No, exactly. I mean, they're in there. They're in the mix for sure.
Yeah. They're also in the mix with Johnny B. Good on Ram It Down. Which...
And granted, that's their influence. I mean, that's where they came from. Chuck Berry and that was big on, American rock and roll was big on British radio, and that's what they grew up listening to. So I mean, I understand the thoughts behind doing the cover, but God, a metalhead doesn't want to hear that shit?
No. As much as I love Chuck Berry, because I grew up listening to a lot of that kind of stuff with my dad.
Yep.
Yeah, there's a time and a place, and Judas Priest album is probably not the one for it.
No.
Yeah, so let's see. I'm glad I highlighted this because we're kind of talking mid-90s, and you and I both know King Fowley, of course, from Deceased.
Of course.
Great guy. And I've talked to King a lot over the years. And I remember him telling me a long time ago that, around this same time, right here in the mid-90s, he was trying to get, I think he was on Nuclear Blast or Century Media at the time. Deceased was doing pretty good around this time. And he was trying to get one of those same labels interested in releasing some of his October 31st project material, which, they did some great stuff.
Yep.
And, he was flat out told, nicely but bluntly by, I think he said it was some of the guys at Nuclear Blast. I could be wrong. It may be, one of the other big labels. They're like, look, King, there's no market for this, October 31st, this traditional power metal stuff. We can't give it away. There's no market for it. Shut up about that. Deceased, we can market. We can't market October 31st to anyone. They just told him flat out, it's not that we don't want October 31st. We want nothing to do with that entire style of heavy metal.
Was he talking to the Nuclear Blast office, or was he talking to Relapse, which was Nuclear Blast America for a while? Because those guys were going to tell him that, because I don't think they all got along all that well.
Don't know. Again,
and none of those in October 31st would not have done well on Relapse.
Oh no, definitely not.
Nuclear Blast may be a different situation,
Maybe, but yeah, I got the idea he had shopped it around and just zero interest.
Yeah.
And within a year or so of that happening, this came along. Hammer Falls, Glory to the Brave, and it reignites the entire style, with a style that really, especially in the US, had been all but dead for 7-ish years at that point. So
I wish I could go back in time because I got that as a promo when I was writing for Maniacs, and man, I fucking hated it. I hated it. I couldn't stomach any. I was all death metal minded and black metal, and and now
Mhm.
I gave it away or threw it away. There was a time I used to throw a lot of shit away, but now I'm interested. I watched some live stuff of them, and they're a little they're on the cheesy side for me, but there's still some good
Mhm.
shit going on. And I mean, that guy, what he was in Ceremonial Oath and Crystal Age,
Yep, the death metal
has
root.
some death metal pedigree for sure, some Scandinavian death metal pedigree.
Yeah, and if I remember right, Anders Johansson's on this, drummer who goes all the way back to Malmsteen's albums that you were showing earlier.
Yep.
So I mean, they have early power metal roots come back out. But this, again, for younger folks who may not realize that, whether you like this band or whether you think this is cheesy, and they can definitely lean that way. You're right. You cannot understate how important this album in particular was at getting interest going again in power metal outside of Europe and Japan.
That had a huge push behind it too. That was a Nuclear Blast release, wasn't it?
It is a Nuclear Blast release, yep, and had a tremendous push. It did.
Yep.
It got covered everywhere, and rightly so. It's a great album.
I need to get it. That's one of them I need to track down.
Yeah, I lost interest in the band. I felt like they pretty quickly got stuck in a rut. They found a very set niche and just kind of started churning out very samey albums. But this one really ignites it. It wasn't the only thing. You also had Rhapsody come out same year with their first one, Legendary Tales. And this coming out of Italy, and this band, of course, caught fire very quickly. Later, you would have a Rhapsody of Fire, literally, eventually.
Yep.
But this got a huge boon to power metal. And you also, I don't have it, but Stradivarius's Destiny comes out right here, this window too. And they had made a few albums earlier in the 90s, but never got any press. They were on very tiny labels. Their vocalists were hit or miss. But by Destiny, they really were the third one here that caught fire right in that time period.
What label was that first one on? I know they were on Limb for a while. Wasn't it Limb or something they were on? A weird...
Yep, LMP, and
LMP,
with SPV.
Yep.
And so, and it's funny because you've got a Swedish band, an Italian band, and Stradivarius, Finland. So yeah, it's not a German band that sort of reinvigorates. It's not a U.S. band. It's not a U.K. band. It's these other European countries that really resuscitate the scene.
Yeah, and Helloween is still going during this time too, and they're still, granted, I don't know many bands other than maybe Riot that have changed out their vocalists so many times and still landed on their feet just about every time. I mean, Iced Earth have done it. Ripper Owens, I like that Civil War album that Iced Earth did, other than a few songs, that Green Face or whatever. I don't care for that song, but the Civil War Iced Earth album is okay. But then they got the guy after, I can't remember his name, Stu Block. They've gone through singers too, and they still keep going. But Helloween, they've seemed to excel every time they change vocalists, and they've had some monsters. I mean, Kiska is a monster, a vocalist.
Yeah.
Very, very much Jeff Tate influenced, very much Rob Halford, Bruce Dickinson influenced.
Very much. Oh yeah. But yeah, you have a lot of those bands, and yeah, you're right. Helloween had been soldiering along, and now they are ready to catch fire again. Gamma Ray is perfectly positioned, somewhere out in space, comes out around that time and does.
And they did very well. I mean, they never toured the U.S., but he didn't want to. After touring the U.S., it didn't go well for Helloween, so he's like, I'm just gonna pick smaller tours and stay in the market that I know. And Gamma Ray got to be kind of a big band, and they kept plugging along. They kept putting out quality albums. They've only really put out a couple so-so albums, but even their so-so shit's still enjoyable to me.
Yeah, they've been very consistent over the years. Blind Guardian still is strong at that point, and they kind of come out with the defining point of their career with Nightfall in Middle Earth in '98. They were never the same after this album. They kind of peaked here, but this is.
I like the Night at the Opera too. I thought that was. I mean, I don't know. They're still hanging in there, I think.
They're not bad. They're worth checking out. But this album did so much. So many people caught wind of this because of the Lord of the Rings tie-in. Was just like, oh wow, there's another huge gate thrown wide open for power metal all over again. But yeah, moving forward here, it's very much a European thing.
Yeah.
Other than Iced Earth, who do we mention? There are good power metal bands from the US. I'm not saying there's not, but who's carrying that flag? Who's really on the map that everybody knows at that point? I'm sure there's probably someone I'm overlooking, and somebody's.
Yeah, I'm sure there's something I'm not thinking of.
We'll have plenty of angry comments down
Yeah.
below for how
Well, you know, like I said at the beginning, it's hard to nail it down just a handful. You have to, you know, look at the ones that were important to us as a listener, and then branch out from there. And of course, you know, you have to mention the shit that's popular and you know, genre defining, which European power metal took over. And
yeah,
I've got a lot of my buddy Zoller sends me a bunch of shit. He'll check out anything, and I get boxes of like second-rate power metal stuff from the US that I don't even remember the names of the bands that are poorly produced, but very much in the vein of the European style. And it's the production is a big part of it. Production is very much a big part of the whole power metal aesthetic. That could be the sixth member. The production is very much a part of that super clicky drum sound and just the way everything is so tightened together. And if you don't have that, if you have like maybe production like early Omen records where there's very much a hold on.
Oh, sure.
Gotta go. It's not done.
Almost done.
Sorry.
Oh, no worries. No, we'll wrap up here soon.
I knew this was going on, and you just had to come down and do it anyway. But anyway,
that's cool. That's cool.
But
yeah, no, you're right. The production, you know, the power metal has a sound that people expect with it. This very clear, very bright kind of sound. Yeah, everything's got to be, you know, again, you're dealing with typically, and it's something we didn't mention, but when you get into this, you know, this new renaissance of power metal, it is once again led by this virtuoso level musicianship with your Timo Tolkis and Stradivarius and the Luca Turillis and Rhapsody, again, drawing on Malmsteen's influence, of course.
Very much so.
And again, it is odd for us to think of it that, you know, that's, you know, the definition of power metal so many people know, but at the same time, those albums, you know, Glory to the Brave, Hammerfall, that is now a 23-year-old album. You and I are old, my friend.
I see it every day and I look in the mirror.
Yeah, but I remember that album coming out. I remember writing a review of that album for Underground Metal Zine. Holding the promo, sending it back, you know, because the guy that was running the zine, you know, he's like, you can review this, but you got to send it back to me because I ain't giving it away.
That's bullshit.
That's fine. It's like, that's cool. But yeah, I mean, it's 23 years old. So for a lot of people, yeah, they've grown up and this is the only power metal, you know, this has been power metal their whole life, is this European style that, you know, to us is kind of the second wave of power metal. It's
and I think it's pretty interesting to note also that the European power metal, yes, it can branch into AOR realms. Like, we'll keep it within the lineage there. Unisonic. I don't know if you've been much of a Unisonic fan. Have you heard any of that stuff? You
told me to check it out, and I did. And that the second album, the brown gold covered one, is tremendous. It's a Helloween album with AOR aspirations.
Very much so. But the first album, the self-titled, is very much an AOR rock album, adult-oriented rock. And it took me for a loop because Kai wrote a lot of that stuff, and I think the other guy wrote a lot of which is funny because it sounds like a Helloween album, but Kai didn't do as much stuff on the second album.
Was the other guy Mandy or Dennis Ward?
I don't remember. It's a guy, Pink Cream 69, and the bass player, I can't remember.
I'm not sure.
I'm having a hard time remembering the names of them, but
that's okay. I just know that
European style is very much adult-oriented rock. It shifted to that. It could influence that, but other than that, it kind of stayed within its wheelhouse. Whereas the US's early power metal style was very much influential to hard rock, traditional metal, and also thrash. I mean, and I just see maybe the US early power metal scene as being a little more versatile as far as that goes.
Yep.
A little less burdened by what they should be and just kind of focused on what they are, you know.
Yeah. You mentioned the thrash thing, and a couple that we forgot to mention we had tagged before, Fistful of Metal and Tales of Terror.
Yeah.
Anthrax and Helloween, those first albums, everyone thinks of those as thrash bands, but those first albums, not that thrashy.
No, I mean, Tales of Terror really isn't thrashy. It's just good, solid, well, power metal, heavy metal, power metal, you know.
Yeah. Fistful of Metal sounds, very, very different from everything Anthrax did afterwards. It's like the first Overkill album. It has a very, yes, more.
Well, Tales of Terror starts off with Plunging to Megadeth, which is kind of a thrashy song, you know.
It has thrash leanings in that album, but yeah, it's not as, by the time you get to, what's the second one called?
Death and Insanity.
Yeah, now that's very much getting into a thrash wheelhouse, I feel. But so yeah, those bands are different, and that kind of leads us to wrapping up. You have this new thing, that's happened in recent years with the new wave of traditional heavy metal, but a lot of those bands like Traveler, Riot City, Portrait,
Haunt,
yeah.
that band is like, everybody's talking about that band and showing off records. I have not heard them.
I've heard a little bit of Haunt. I don't have a lot of these on hard copy, but one I do have that I think is awesome is this by Fortress. Out of California, and it's called new wave of traditional heavy metal, but I feel like a lot of these bands draw a lot of influence from the bands we've been chatting about tonight, and leaning more towards that power metal camp, the Omens and the Savage Graces and the Thundersteels, and a million others.
Everybody's ranting and raving about Night Demon.
I haven't checked out much Night Demon, but yeah, I know the name. But these bands owe a lot to that Omen and the classic metal blade sound. We could name probably 50 of those metal blade bands: Tyrant, Thrust.
Yep.
So many that these new bands sound like that, but they don't call themselves new wave of power metal. They call themselves new wave of traditional metal.
Right.
So even there, it's like by today's definitions, people don't want to put those bands into that, the Stradivarius and Gamma Ray.
Oh yeah, because then instantly they're like, you're not power metal. You don't sound anything like Stradivarius, or you don't sound anything like Blind Guardian, or
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, you don't sound anything like the power metal of this century.
Right.
If you go back a little bit further, you do sound like the power metal of the 1980s.
Yep.
But again, does it matter whether you call it power metal or traditional metal? Absolutely not. It's all really great metal.
Yep. And in this whole new renaissance, I have not checked out rarely any of it. I've heard Night Demon, they're okay. I don't know why it's not really connecting with me. I don't know. It's weird.
Yeah,
I wasn't there for it when it started. I don't know. It's weird.
I think it's some of it I'm going to blame on our age, that these bands can be perfectly good, but in our minds, we hear it and we immediately start to think, oh yeah, that's a little bit like Omen.
Yeah.
But we're comparing it. We already have that established in our head. So it's just like, well, I could keep listening to this, or hey, this kind of makes me want to go listen to Battle Cry, or anything. I'll go listen to my Omen records and my Savage Grace records. I don't need the full discography of Traveler on my shelf to hear that style of metal. Traveler's pretty good, and as to someone who's 20 years old who hasn't listened to all this older stuff, they sound phenomenal. I know they do.
Sure.
I've talked to those kids, like the story I was telling you before. But for you and I, it's kind of like, yeah, I've heard this before. This is still really good.
And the positive side of that, though, is it's like the guy from Night Demon was very much into Kira Thungal, and he revitalized that band. He plays bass in that band now.
Yes.
He got that band back together, and they put out a new album.
And it's a fantastic album.
I have not heard it yet, but it's this new renaissance is getting the old bands that maybe didn't get their due back in the day, that are like seen as a cult band. They're getting them their time in the sun again before they're too old to do it anymore.
Yeah, they did. Manila Road, with the European festival circuit, they finally got some recognition before.
Yeah. And I'm glad he saw that before he passed. I'm glad. Yes. I saw them in there was a classic metal fest in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and that's the only time I saw Manila Road. It was when they first got back together. They put out Atlantis Rising, which to me is a great fucking album. I love that album. And they were so good, and they were just working man's heavy metal, and they nailed it. They went up there with that 70s mentality, just rocking these humongous solos. I mean, Shelton was such a monster guitar player, great drummer, great bass player, great singers. And I'm glad they got to see because I think when Manila Road was coming out, no one gave a shit about them. You know,
Oh, that was up until Atlantis Rising came out. That was the definition of a band that everybody had heard of, and nobody had actually sat down and listened to.
yeah,
Yeah, I remember trying to find those Manila Road records in like the mid and late '90s, and it was like, oh yeah, I kind of remember that name. Don't have any of their stuff. Sorry, it took forever to track their stuff down back in
yeah.
that time frame. Everybody knew the name, but nobody really had ever heard the music.
Yeah, my buddy Jeff Wagner, he made me a mixtape, and he's like, dude, you need to work through what you think about this and listen to it. And it finally, when it clicked hard. And then right around the same time, Atlantis Rising showed up in my mailbox as a promo, and I'm like, holy shit, this is really, really well done, really good, excellent metal, really, really great.
They're back. Yep.
Yeah, they're back, and they put out a lot of great records after they reformed, a lot of great stuff.
They did. Somebody should make a video about that.
I know. Maybe I'll drag you along with me on that one. We'll do another.
give me a heads up. I need to catch up. There's a lot of holes in their catalog that I haven't heard, but I'd be glad to come along for the ride. Absolutely.
That'd be fun.
And this has been fun, but I think we're probably at a good point to wrap it up here.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts or names you wanted to shout out before we close it down?
No names to shout out. Just, again, we're just two old dudes trying to pigeonhole music into categories, but and obviously we've missed a bunch of stuff, and maybe there's a lot of bands that we mentioned that you don't think is power metal.
Probably so. Yep.
But now that would be a great time to flood this gentleman's comment box with a bunch of nasty letters. I don't have to deal with it.
Let's talk metal in the comments down below and tell us how horribly, horribly wrong we were about everything we said tonight.
Right.
But yeah, mention those other bands that we didn't have time to bring up. And you're right. Just the last point I'll make is you're absolutely right. They're trying to pigeonhole music into, is it power metal or traditional metal? Doesn't matter at the end of the day. I think it's just an interesting exercise, though, to look back and see that it isn't something that came strictly from Europe, that, it kind of evolved in the US alongside Europe. It evolved earlier than a lot of people recognize.
Yeah. And it had its own thing going. It had its own.
Yes.
Each band had its own version of the same muse,
Yeah. There was power metal before Keepers of the Seven Keys. And then there was power metal after Keeper of the Seven Keys. And then there was this, other Europe only kind of scene. And then you had another wave that came in the wake of Hammerfall and Rhapsody and Stratovarius. So, power metal is, gone through a lot of permutations, and there's a lot of styles to it. It's not all, just that, frilly, virtuoso European stuff. There's a lot of other things out there to explore in the world of power metal.
And I didn't show any Lost Horizon this time because I thought I would show restraint, but
I was waiting for it. I was waiting for it. I gave you that last chance.
Amazing power metal. Get both of their albums.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Marty. Thanks so much for doing this. It's been a lot of fun. And
thank you, Alan. It was great. I had a great time.
Same here. We'll see you again soon. Everybody take care. And until next time, keep banging your heads.